technical problem. We'll be right there.
The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this amazing Friday night. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving. I did. We went out to an amazing restaurant in Old San Juan and had a phenomenal meal out there. Looking forward to actually doing Christmas in California. So we'll be out there in California. That'll be fun. All right, great. We've got Greg with us today. Hey, Greg, how's it going?
Happy holidays.
And, what's that?
Happy holidays now that we're in the season of giving.
Thanksgiving. Yeah. Did you have a good Thanksgiving yesterday?
Yeah, we had Ben Bayer and his wife and some other friends came over.
Oh, good. So Ben's moved to Austin already?
Yeah, he's more in Austin than I am. I'm in a suburb outside of it. He's right in the thick of things.
All right. So we've Austin is becoming this center of objectivism, resurrecting its title from the 90s when I lived there, and it was there was more stuff going on in Austin around objectivism than anywhere else in the country. So it's great to see it come back to that. All right, so we are going to jump into the fray, into probably the most controversial topic in the news cycle right now, and that is this issue of election fraud, and which is, it's been going on now since Election Day, which is hard to believe, but it's already 3.5 weeks ago, and this continues almost 3.5 weeks, and still no end for it to sight. And actually, I actually think that it's never going to end. That is, that the idea that this election was stolen by Biden is going to stay in the minds of certain people, and certainly Trump will encourage this for eternity, for the rest of his life. And so nothing in that respect will change. But so we will get resolution to this election, at least in terms of practical terms. So what we want to do today is we'll talk about some of the examples from this. We won't talk about all of them. There's no way to talk about all of them. Every one you deal with, 5 other pop out somewhere else, and you just can't. It's like whack-a-mole. You can't keep track of these. Every day there's a new claim. That's the nature, as we'll see, of the arbitrary. We're going to try to talk about this in kind of principle, and with the idea of what is evidence, what is required to establish something as evidence, and then maybe about how much evidence is necessary to establish something as worth looking at, worth examining, and then actually true. So, and we'll look at the arbitrary, and we'll do it in the context of the election and with some examples of this. So, thanks, Greg. Greg had the idea for a show about this, so thanks for having the idea, and thanks for joining me to do it. So, first, I'm curious about your general impressions of these claims and kind of people's attitude broadly to them.
I'm not surprised, because I think Trump has been the candidate of the arbitrary since before his run in 2016. He came onto the political stage with the birther conspiracy, which was an arbitrary claim. And if you've been following him and following how these claims play out, and if you remember the kinds of things objectivists used to say about the arbitrary and how it works out back in the 90s and earlier, when we were, when Leonard Peikoff really is the one who articulated views on this first and really had some good classes on the subject. and lectures, you could just see it followed exactly the pattern that you'd expect. But what I'm more interested in thinking about than declaring this arbitrary or is it arbitrary is just how should one think about evidence in the first place? And I think it's definitely true that Trump spouts a lot of arbitrary opinions and that there are a lot of arbitrary opinions spouted about the election and about fraud. That doesn't show you that there's not some evidence somewhere in some needle of real evidence in the haystack of pretend evidence and or pretend claims. And so how should one think about this? How does one go about assessing evidence? And that's what I think it's clear from a lot of the conversation I hear from people about it, that they just haven't thought much about what is evidence? What does it take to be evidence? And one other thought about the arbitrary, I mean, there are two. The arbitrary is that which is asserted in defiance of the need for evidence, and it's a brazen thing. And to accuse somebody of trafficking in the arbitrary or asserting the arbitrary is a really serious accusation, and that needs evidence for it. The guy doesn't have evidence that he hasn't given you yet, or he's about to give you, or he's mistaken to think it's evidence. To claim that someone's doing that, as they claim about Trump, is a serious claim about someone. And we could talk about what the evidence for that is. But there's another issue that I think is more important than judging about somebody. This guy is spouting the arbitrary and it's bad. It's for you, for your own sake. Mm-hmm. Here's a claim. Do I have evidence for this? Maybe that other guy who says he has evidence for it does have evidence for it, and I don't understand it or don't know it, or it comes later how to judge these other people. I want to know what's true. How can I tell what's true here? There are some questions about this election. There are all these articles from all these different point of views spilling out different things. Things are said to be evidence of this or said to be evidence of that. How can I tell what counts as evidence for me? I'm selfish. I want to know what's true. And so how should I process it when all this information is flying at me? And I think that question's more important than how do you judge some other party as being irrational? And I think only once you think about what do you selfishly need to understand something, for something to help you tell what's true, which is what evidence does. It helps you tell that something's true. Once you think about what you need for that, that then puts you in a position to think about other people who are pitching you claims and so forth. Are they respecting my cognitive needs? Are they being objective in their presentation, or are they trying to snow me in one way or another?
Yeah. So I'm getting complaints that your sound isn't great. I don't know where your mic is, or
is it too loud, too quiet, distorting?
It's too quiet, and it's a little echoey, but I'm not sure we can do much about the echoes, but maybe
I move the mic closer to me.
I think that's better. I think
it's
that's
a different
better.
mic than I usually use, so I'm still getting the hang of it.
Let me see if I can change anything on my end to try to improve it. We'll see. All right. Yeah, so I agree completely. The main thing that really needs to be considered is, what do I need to know if something is not true? We haven't got to true yet, right? But is there evidence here, or is this arbitrary? So they're saying it's muffled, but I think that's, it might be just the mic.
Yeah, it's a new kind of fancy podcasting mic that I've got set up in this computer setup I have, and I haven't used it much yet. Being that I normally, if you guys see me online, I'm talking from another room in my house. Is it clear? I could try to futz with the settings for the mic, but I don't know what that'll cause if I try it. So.
No, I think it's better. I think we'll just run with it. It's a little muffled, but I think it's not too bad. So yeah, I think the focus is, what do I need to know when somebody says something? I mean, there's a lot of claims post this election about votes appearing out of nowhere, or Dominion Systems, which is this producer of voting systems, being just an arm of the Democratic Party and being completely controlled by Democrats. So people make these claims, right? Mm-hmm. What is the first thing one should do in trying to assess, okay, do I know that this is true, or can I even, how do one even relate to a statement like that in a heated environment that is something like an election?
So I think the first thing is if the ultimate claim that we're thinking about is there voter fraud, or is there evidence of widespread voter
Yeah,
fraud?
David says it sounds like the mic is probably not connected, or your computer is set to. It sounds like.
Hold on. Let me see what. I see what's going on. It's thank you, David, whoever said that.
Much better. All right.
Getting the sound from a different microphone. So you've pointed me to what I needed to know to solve this. Is that better?
Thanks, David. Yes, much better.
Okay, so here's something like there's something wrong with my audio, right? What's the evidence for that in my mind? Well, people are complaining. I had an initial theory, maybe I don't know how to use this microphone, but the theory, we then get a particular suggestion. It's sounding muffled like it's the computer's microphone rather than mine. And then we were able to test it and see. So yeah, if the claim you're initially investigating is, some people say there's election fraud. Okay, is there any evidence of that? For something to be evidence of election fraud, then we can go to the other claims and is there evidence of them, right? Sure. One, you have to know that it's true, the thing that's supposed to be evidence, or at least have good reason to believe that it's true. So all the questions about if someone tells you, here's evidence of election fraud, Dominion's was co-founded by Chavez and this and that and the other thing. If you don't know if any of that's true, then you don't know if any of it's evidence. Then the second thing is, so the one is, how do you know that the evidence is true in the first place, right? And then the other, and I think a lot of people just aren't asking that. Rudy Giuliani said this, or, it's not just a Republican thing. There were all kinds of claims of election fraud in 2016 also that kind of quickly died down, but there was a period where people worried about had the Russians not just engaged in a disinformation campaign, but, got access to election computers and so forth. So it's not, this isn't one side of the political spectrum or another that has a monopoly on this. But anyway, someone claimed this is, do I have a reason to believe that it's true in the first place? If it is it evidence, right? And then second, how does it connect to the thing being proven that you're trying to prove or trying to have evidence for? Because in order for one fact to count as evidence of a conclusion in a person's mind, in your mind, right, there's always a lot of other things that you would need to know. So in assessing whether a given piece of evidence is evidence for you, you need to work out what those other things are and check whether you really know them. So if we take a particular example, there were more voters than there were people registered to vote in a certain county. First of all, is that even true? Some of the claims of that, that claim's been made with regard to a lot of different places. It turns out at least some of the places it's been named for, it comes from somebody confusing two different states and getting the counties wrong, so it wasn't even true. But then suppose that it is true. Is that evidence of voter fraud? Well, that depends. How does voter registration work? Can the rolls is the rolls that the one piece of data being taken from sometimes out of date and there's another place, which is what actually counts for whether you can vote? Do they have same day registration in the state? And if they have same day registration, does that mean people show up and register? So you have to know something about how the registration and the other stuff works to know if this is evidence that there's voter fraud. And you can know that or you cannot. So you have to think about what do I know? What would I need to know that this fact, if it is indeed a fact, if it's true, supports this other conclusion? And do I know it? And one thing to do, often you'll be able to just tell that by yourself. Sometimes you won't, because you just are so ignorant of a field. You have the sense of, I don't know how things fit together in this field. Sounds convincing, but I have the feeling by contrasting it with fields that I really understand, that I'm a little bit out to sea here. And then you should notice that about yourself and go sort of read up and look at people who know about the field, if you're interested in it, and see what they say. Are so ignorant of a field. My phone started to, you know what it is? I had tuned into your show earlier and.
Okay, so it's on the show. Yeah. All right, so if somebody's interested, right? So I'd like to know whether the legitimacy of this election, whether the election is legitimate. I think all Americans want to know that. And people are making claims, seemingly legitimate people. Now, we'll get to that in a minute, because who makes the claim, I think, is really, really important. But let's assume a certain segment of the population believes that people like Rudy Giuliani are legit and honest, and they remember them from post 9/11 when he was mayor of New York and he came across as heroic and substantive. What do I do at this point? That is, how do you deal with that? Assuming, let's say that first that the person conveying the information seems to be a legitimate source for the information.
Yes, I would say there are two things you have to do in general in thinking, and it comes up here. One is recognize that knowing things takes work. So recognize that to know that the election was tampered with, or to know that the election's, legitimate, right, requires outsourcing. It requires someone to do a whole lot of work. Someone has to count to know it's legitimate. Someone has to count the vote. Someone has to collate the information coming from different people who are counting the votes and reach a thing. And then when somebody's claiming there's something wrong with that process, someone needs to investigate all the evidence. So there's work involved in knowing. And you just have to accept the fact that if it takes work to accomplish something, then if you don't do the work, you're not going to accomplish it, or you're going to have to rely on someone else to do it. So you should drop the premise that I should just be able to know or just be able to tell. And you'll notice that when people are trying to con you or put something over on you, you'll often get it presented with the, don't you know? Doesn't everyone know? Isn't it obvious? Things aren't obvious. They take work to know them. And if you or someone hasn't done the work, then you don't have the knowledge. So first notice that, and then think about what work am I willing to do? Then if you notice that the work requires specialized knowledge in some of the cases, you're going to have to outsource it to experts and, decide which experts you can trust and whether you trust them and so forth. And there's a whole, a lot to say about how to tell who's an expert. But the one thing that I want to stress here that's really important is you've got to be honest in your thinking about how you know this. So if, or why you think it. So if the thing is you trust Rudy Giuliani, and you have reasons to, he was the mayor of New York. You think he did a good job. Before that, he was a prosecutor, so he knows the law and he's had cases. We can debate how good or bad he was at any of these things, but he's not some, wino off the street who just spouts some theory, right? If your reason for believing it is Rudy Giuliani has made this claim and you think of him as a person of substance, then you should hold it in your mind as, I take this seriously because Rudy said it, rather than hold it in your mind as, I take it seriously because there are all these affidavits. Like Rudy's given you his chain of reasoning, and you don't want to think like you've done that reasoning and you can prove it the way he does, because you haven't done that work. You've just heard Rudy give a press conference. So you say, Rudy gave this press conference, I trust Rudy, and Rudy claims he'll be able to back it up in court. And you can hold it like that. But then if somebody else says, why do you think this? You shouldn't go to, well, this affidavit and that affidavit, and there are more things in this and more people in this county in Georgia. Just say, I trust Rudy, and that's what I'm going on. And that can be perfectly legitimate. You can't do all the work and research yourself. And then you should say, here's how credible I think this guy is. I don't think I know this, but I think it's a plausible investigation because I think Rudy's a serious person and he said it, if that's what you think. And then have a view about what you're going to do going forward. Like, I think this, he said he's going to prove it in court. I'll wait to see what happens with the judge. But the issue that I want to stress is the kind of honesty with yourself of, how do you know this? What's your chain of evidence personally? And it goes through Rudy and your judgment of his character, rather than thinking you've done the work that he purports to have done.
Yeah, and one of the things that is important in something like this is, so let's say you start out with apposition. I trust Rudy. Rudy said this, and then case after case, the courts, the entity that's supposed to do the work to figure this out, say, no, there's no evidence here. There's nothing, and they throw it out. Or you start reading on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, kind of the counter evidence to what Rudy's saying. The fact that there are fact checkers out there, and that even Rudy's retracting some of his earlier claims, because it turns out there's this one example where there's a tweet. Let me just find this. There was a tweet where there were 100-something thousand votes, right? 100-something thousand votes that supposedly, like this, just flipped increased in Biden's case. So there was a tweet and a Facebook announcement saying, look, here's the picture before, and then 10 minutes later, nothing's changed, and Biden has an extra 156,000 votes or something like that. And what's up with this? And then everybody retweets it and people comment on it and everything. And then later on, it turns that, yes, there was an adjustment made because of some clerical error and somebody had forgot a zero and they adjusted it and they made the adjustment. It also turns out that they got the two screenshots the other way around, and actually the extra 156,000 votes went to Trump, not to Biden. And it turns out that everything about the story was wrong, right? And yet the same people who are arguing every other theory about fraud were arguing this theory just as passionately, just as with as much conviction, as much. And once these things start accumulating, you should start doubting your sources of information.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. You've got to be, if your judgment is in part based on someone's character, you have to update as you learn new things about their character. And what we all have here is kind of, unless you've actually read all these affidavits yourself, right, and done all that work yourself, you're relying on other people's claims. You're relying in effect on expert testimony from various lawyers and things, and you should be checking, how reliable is it? When they predict something's going to happen, does it happen? How right are they? How often are they right? And then even if you do try to read it all yourself, you might lack the expertise to do it. Nothing is easier than to make what seems like a convincing case to somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about. There's an old aphorism, a little learning is a dangerous thing. And it's true. If I tell you a little bit about COVID-19 and how it spreads, and you only know these couple of things, it's easy to then prove things to you beyond any doubt in your mind. I mean, not necessarily you, but it's easy to prove things to someone beyond any doubt in that person's mind if they think they know more than they do, and they've just learned a few facts and they don't know any of the context, any of the things they need to keep in mind. That's why we need experts. You shouldn't be a slavish kind of you believe whatever the expert says, but you can't. Doing a Google search or learning 2 or 3 things doesn't put you in the possession of being an expert on the subject.
And it's striking how many people are. I mean, other than some people are dishonest, what do you think causes people to think that they know and that they are experts on something because they've read a few articles in Google? Google, which then they condemn as a site that only gives them biased information and therefore should be regulated by the government so that the government can provide us with unbiased information in the future.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things. It's knowing is work. And this is a big theme I've stressed in a lot of my lectures. And in every area of life where something is work, people want to take shortcuts.
Yep.
And the two kind of shortcuts that amount to the same thing are, they amount to subjectivism one way or another, are skepticism, you can't know anything, you can never tell, or false certainty, dogmatism, I can tell what's true, isn't it obvious that? I can know this without doing the work, or nobody could possibly do the work, so nobody could possibly know it. And if you actually think about the things you really know in whatever field you're best. If you're an expert at, you're a chef and you really know why putting flour thickens a sauce, or you're in finance and you've gone through the issues like Yaron has and understand why certain things are happening in the banking sector, or whatever area it is where you really know something, and you've had to earn that knowledge. It's been hard work. If you really think about that as your paradigm of knowledge for yourself. That is your paradigm for knowledge in complex thinking. I mean, obviously, that there's a cup on the table or something, it's a little bit of work, but not too much to understand what it means for it to be a cup, right? But if you think of that as your paradigm of knowledge, you think, yeah, this is possible. I know what it takes. And so it's possible. You can't tell me I don't know what I know. But I recognize for other claims that it would require someone doing this work. It would require me doing this work if I were to know it sort of solo. And if I'm not going to know it solo, but I'm going to know it through relying on people in a division of labor information economy, then I have to be getting my information from people who I have every reason to think are doing this work, the bits of the work that I'm not doing. And I have to be judging them and doing what work I need to do to assess them and to assess how the information integrates for me. And I've given some courses on how to do this at Ocon's years back. It's collected in a lecture series on Ayn Rand campus on thinking objectively. But you have the idea that it takes work, then it's easier to avoid being puffed up and thinking you know things too quickly.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting to use yourself as a reference point. That is, to use your own knowledge as a reference point. So, so there's certain things I know. You mentioned finance. I know the Middle East. I know these things really well. And then I read a newspaper, and what I discover when I read the news is they're wrong about these things almost all the time. Then why would I believe they're right about anything else that they write there where I'm not an expert, where I don't know? So it immediately causes me to think. And the same with Rudy Giuliani, right? So my assessment of Rudy is he's been so wrong on so many things. And he is so morally despicable for things he did in the 1980s, primarily in the 90s, that I don't trust anything he says, because where I know he's been wrong, right? The stuff I really know he's wrong on. So I don't trust him on anything. It's exact opposite of kind of the people who take his word as always the truth. But using your own reference and figuring out, knowing what it took you to know something really well, and then applying it to everything, right? Applying it to what you really know and what you don't know, and assessing information that comes in and the level of expertise. Think about Rudy saying something about your area of expertise that is at the equivalent shallowness of what he's saying here, and how upset you would be.
So the issue with the news, though, is also, it's not just that you know a lot about the Middle East and then you see the news and it's inaccurate, so you can't trust the news on anything. You also see the ways in which they're inaccurate and the ways in which they're not. So they don't make up, whole countries that don't exist or whatever in the Middle East, but they get wrong lots of things about the causality of it. And they, now you know a lot more about the Middle East than I do, so you can give many more examples, I'm sure. And your ability to detect what they're good on and bad on is going to be a lot more well-honed than mine in that area. But it's not just you put people in the camp of everything they say is gospel and I can trust it, or to hell with these people. If you did the latter with journalism as a whole profession, you'd hardly be able to know anything. But you get a sense of what kinds of things do they get right and what kind of things do they get wrong. And you think about why. What are they doing such that they're able to get right what they get right and not able to get right what they don't get right?
Yes, and then I call it, when I listen to NPR, I adjust for the bias. So the kind of mistakes or the kind of bias that they have. And you can hopefully, not always, but hopefully you can glean out what is valuable from what they're reporting, and dismiss the interpretations, the stuff that they're leaving out, and then, but you still don't know it. You still have to. You always realize that even that stuff, you need to check. You need to do something, to verify what's going on. That's why I read so many different news sources. I don't count on one. Because any one of them could be wrong, even on the concrete sometimes.
And part of the way you check is you don't go out of your way each fact that comes to you to fact check it. You do that when you're using it or when you're relying on it, right? So you're going to write an article or you're going to make a claim, and the New York Times, you're counting on them to be right about this. Well, then you check and see some other papers and you see if they are right. But the other thing you do is you try to arrange your life and your information consumption so that salient counter evidence will come up for you. Mm-hmm. So I think Fox, for example, is a pretty low quality news source compared to newspapers.
Yep.
But I'm really glad that Fox exists, because there's a certain type of story that I'm worried that might get played down or suppressed or not shown by the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN or whatever. And that there's a Fox means that, if I keep an eye on their headlines, it'll come to my attention. And even if I don't, it'll come to enough people's attention that it'll get thrown to my attention eventually. So, you want to think about what's the media ecosystem here? How am I using it and relying on it?
Yeah, and there's a value to even the fact that Fox might fact check the New York Times, the New York Times might fact check Fox, and that they each have an incentive not to let the other get too out of whack in terms of what they're doing. So we hear all this stuff. It's important for people to understand that what they're getting is not, for them, epistemologically, it's not knowledge. They're getting maybe information. They're not even getting evidence yet. They're getting statements people take. Maybe they can do a little bit of research. Maybe they can do a lot of research to discover whether there's legitimacy or illegitimacy to this. How much do you do? I mean, like I saw a list. I think somebody posted a list of all the different claims of it's another part of, I think, the problem is when you see these long lists of 300 different ways in which fraud was committed, you start thinking, who out there is sophisticated enough to organize 300 different ways in which to commit fraud in a particular direction, one direction? I mean, I think when the dailies had dead people voting in Chicago to swing the election to Kennedy, which there's some proof of in 1960. They organized, the dailies controlled Chicago. They did it in one place. They used one methodology and they just scammed everybody. They didn't do it across many states, 300 different ways. And with this just randomness to the different accusations. So what do you do with all this stuff that's coming in if you're really trying to figure out what's going on?
Well, one thing you have to do, I think, in life in general, is develop a sense for what kinds of arguments lead to truth and what kind don't. Aristotle called this paideia, or educatedness, and there are you can have it with respect to a field, or you could have it in general. Obviously, having it in general is you're a critical thinker, a person who's able to evaluate things, and that doesn't give you the specific expertise for every field, but then there's a specific abilities to know what kind of arguments work in this field. And one thing that element of being educated and able to reason well is knowing that when there are many different arguments pointing to the same conclusion in unrelated ways, it's usually a sign that they're not that good. That is, there's generally a chain of evidence for something that's true, and it's one, maybe two independent chains, not 15. That's just, typically when someone's giving you a whole lot of arguments, they're trying to throw things at the wall and see what sticks. And then in particular, in the case of something like election fraud, if somebody was going to commit election fraud, they would commit it in some way, by some plan, by some scheme, not there'd be a million different independent schemes. So you need more evidence for more different claims. But the way I would think about it is, how do you get off the ground in thinking about this? So all of this evidence, typically the way evidence works, right? Not in every case, but most evidence is by arguments, inference to the best explanation. So some fact occurred or is alleged to occur, but let's suppose now we know what occurred. And then it's evidence for some conclusion because that conclusion's proof is the best explanation of it. So truth is the best explanation of this fact having occurred, or it's the most likely cause of it, or whatever. So one thing you have to think about is, whatever thing I'm taking as my initial evidence, enough evidence to even start investigating this or looking into it, how likely, as far as I'm concerned, and what are my reasons for thinking this, how likely is that to have happened either way, even if the thing I'm thinking about was false? So if you say, like, here's why I start, something seems suspicious about this election. I don't have a whole lot of evidence yet. I'm going to look into it because something seems suspicious. Why does it seem suspicious to you? Well, it seems suspicious to me because there are tons and tons of allegations of fraud of one sort or another. That's why it seems suspicious. So I think maybe there's something to it. I don't know yet, but I think it's worth investigating. Okay, what were the odds that there were going to be an unusual number of claims of fraud, even if there wasn't fraud? The odds were 100%.
Yeah.
If you thought about what was happening a few months before the election, you had every reason to be certain that whether or not there was fraud, there would be a more than usual amount of claims of fraud. Why? Because you've never had before a sitting president alleging it ahead of time and asking everybody to go out and look and try to figure it out. And if you get hundreds and hundreds of people looking into things and trying to figure out if there's fraud, a bunch of them are going to think they see something even if they don't. So you're going to get a more than usual amount of reports. So we knew there were going to be a more than usual amount of reports, which means that the mere fact that there are a more than usual amount of points is exactly of zero value in determining is there fraud. Now, it might be that in that haystack of reports, there are one or two that are evidence, but the fact that there are more reports than usual means nothing. And if you do this with, many, many things, you start to see, well, which ones are evidence that should make me suspicious and which ones just are of no value. And so that particular one, more claims than usual of fraud, of no value. What other ones? If you look at, there are a whole lot of votes, ballots came up that are for Joe Biden at the top of the ballot, but don't have anyone else anywhere else on the ballot. This is for some reason thought to be evidence of fraud. What would you need to know if that's evidence of fraud?
So I've got just an example of that, just a personal story that relates to that. So I voted in the election in Puerto Rico, and I really only cared about the governor. I wanted to vote on the ballot initiative about statehood, and I wanted to vote for the governor, and I was going to vote for the mayor of San Juan. And really beyond that, I don't know anything about Puerto Rican politics. I haven't investigated it. I don't know anything. So I went to the ballot and actually asked my friend and lawyer here, what he'd recommend in terms of who are the good candidates and what would he tell me in each candidate and so on. And I'd made my decision. There were three candidates I was going to vote for: the mayor, the governor, and the representative in DC. And I get the ballot, and of course, you're supposed to vote for congressmen and senators because Puerto Rican has a whole thing. And I look it over and I say, I don't know any of these people. I'm not going to vote for them. So I voted at the top of the ballot. I voted for governor, I voted for mayor, and I voted for the representative. And then I come to put it in the machine. And the machine was kind of stuck and it wasn't quite working. So the woman came over and tried to help me. And she looks at my ballot and she says, look, you haven't voted for all these things. And I said, I don't want to vote for all these things. I don't know any of these people, so I'm not going to vote for them. You said, you really should vote for, she's like one of these, you got to vote, right? It's democracy. I'm saying, but I don't know anything. How would I vote? So I think she expected me to go party line. You voted Republican for this guy, you should vote. I'm not going to vote. So but she was upset because I hadn't voted for every one of the thing. And my guess is in this election in particular, people were voting either for Trump or, probably against Trump, in this case, for Biden. But they didn't really care beyond that, and they left it blank. So
I always only vote for a couple of the things on the ballot, the ones that I know enough to have an opinion on, and I think one's better than the other. Because a lot of them I have a opinion, but it's, this one's slightly better in that way, and that one's slightly better in the other way. And so, yeah, I mean, it's irresponsible to vote the whole ticket. But okay, maybe you think most people do. So when you have a lot of them that are only the top of the ticket, it's evidence for fraud. Well, why? Do you know that? Do you know what percentage of votes of ballots normally have people only voting for one and not the other? Do you know if that's higher or lower in high turnout elections? I would expect in very high turnout elections, it's more likely to have people only voting for one thing because they turned out just about that thing, right? So you need to know that to know even if it was evidence. And I would have thought, not knowing much about elections, that lots of ballots that just have Joe Biden and no one else down ballot on them are evidence against the Democratic conspiracy. If I were Democrats conspiring, I would, if I was bothering to fake a ballot anyway and break the law and expose, myself to all kinds of criminal charges, I'd get all my guys, down the ballot.
Certainly in states where there were close Senate elections and where there were close House elections. I mean, Democrats lost a lot of House seats and didn't gain, almost any of the seats they expected to gain in the Senate.
Which is consistent with the hypothesis that what happened here is you have a country in which a little more than 50% of the people really hate the current president. And, some portion of those people are regular Democrats who want to vote for a lot of Democrats. Some portion of those people are independents who sometimes vote one way. Some portion of them are Republicans who mostly vote Republican but wanted to vote against Trump. And some maybe don't have any opinions other than they don't like Trump. And that's, I think, if you look at all the evidence and try to integrate it, the most likely theory of this election.
So here's a claim, right? So this is this evidence, right? My friend says that Biden did worse than Hillary in every city, except in those states where Biden happened to get a lot more votes than Trump in the end. Right? So I guess in the swing states or in the places where.
In other words, he did worse, except in the places where he did better.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, that's an interesting claim right there. But let's twist this a little bit. Let's say, except in the states where it happened to make a difference. Right. Mm-hmm. So he did badly everywhere except in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona. And there he did much better. But every other city in the country, he did worse. Is this, how would you approach something like that?
So first of all, is it true? I don't know if that's true. I've heard that claim. I haven't looked certainly many places that's true. But is it true every place? I don't know. And how many? Is it 50%, 23%? So is that true? How do we know it's true? Where's the data?
And the data here, just to be clear, the data here is available.
Mm-hmm.
If you really care, you can get the data. You can aggregate the data. You can do a column of 2016, a column of 2020, look at all the cities in the country, see how many votes Biden got in each one of those. My guess is the claim is not true by a long shot, but you can do that.
It's also weird that it's put as cities. So only cities? Is a city any kind of municipality, a district? Votes aren't counted by city. They're counted by county usually. So there's something weird about the way it's formulated that makes me wonder. Often you can find a way to put something that's true but misleading. So, but anyway, suppose that it's true, which you shouldn't. I mean, you should check if you're going to use this as evidence. But I haven't checked. I've heard this claim too, but I've not looked much into it. So suppose it's true. Then the next thing is, what are explanations of that? Well, first of all, campaigns focus on the places they think are going to make differences. Second, we know some trends that have happened. So we know that Trump is doing better with Black and Latino voters than Democrats do typically. And Trump's made a real outreach, especially to Latino voters. The Democrats have been taking these constituencies for granted. So it's plausible that if by cities we mean urban areas, Hillary, who carried them by a landslide in the last election, Biden carried them by a little less than a landslide this time because Trump made progress in those demographics. But it was a small amount of progress, and it was counterbalanced by by voter swings in the suburbs that favored Biden over Trump. That's generally what pundits are saying happened in this election, right? Trump made it a little bit closer in places where he was blown out by Hillary last time, but Biden had much more of a swing towards him in places that were not as blowout for Trump and against Hillary, particularly in suburbs. So if that's what happened, you'd expect there to be cities like that. If what's really meant is cities like Philadelphia, whatever. And then also, what is actually being claimed here? It can't be that Biden got fewer votes than Hillary in every city except the ones that matter, because his vote total was way higher than Hillary's, and it's not in the close places that it was way higher. So maybe it means by percent, but if it's by percent, this is kind of what you'd expect to happen. You'd expect some places to tighten and other places to widen, and you'd expect the widening to be in the places that made a difference. So
yeah, in the places where they put the energy, you'd expect it in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, Wisconsin, in Georgia, in Arizona, where the campaigns put an effort. You know, if Biden's vote totals in California are down, probably went to California once, a few times to fundraise, but he didn't go to actually, do any speeches or anything, because what's the point? He's going to win California no matter what. And we do have an electoral college system, which means you don't go and campaign in states that you're going to win. So it changes the whole campaigning strategy. But yes, first, the data is all available, so you can figure out if this is true or not. I doubt it's true, but you could figure it out. B, even if it's true, doesn't mean it's fraud. Somebody says, do you really believe that 21 million more people voted in this election? I mean, I do. All the evidence suggests that it is. And the fact is that somebody in the thing notes that in Texas, which went for Trump, voting was up 20%.
Yeah.
So there were more voters even in states that went for, I think Florida voter turnout was way up, and it went for Trump. So you can't have it both ways, right? You can't have it that more voters voted because it's a conspiracy, and yet Trump wins in those states. It's the same with these mail-in ballots. I found this interesting. Early in the night, I remember early in the election night, Florida looked like it was going Biden, and it was all blue, and it was gaining in blue. And there was some early signs, particularly in Miami, that this was not going to go well for Biden. But it generally looked like it was going really well for the Democrats. And then suddenly there was this huge wave of votes for Trump. And what happened, and this is exactly the reverse of what happened in Pennsylvania and these other states. And the reason is that mail-in ballots, which everybody recognizes were dominantly for Democrats because Trump told his people not to vote by mail, right? I mean, talk about stupid, but he told them not to vote by mail. So Democrats voted by mail, Republicans tended not to. So all the mail vote in Florida accounted first because they're counted in the weeks leading up to the election. They don't just count them on the day of election. So all of that made the state blue. And then they started counting what people actually voted on the day of election, and that turned it all red. In Pennsylvania, they did the opposite. They don't start counting the mail-in votes until the day of the election. So first you get the physical votes, and then you get all the mail-in votes. So none of these patterns were surprising if you knew anything about the actual voting, and yet the conspiracy theories were rampant.
If you had been listening to people who report on how elections are tabulated beforehand, all of this was, there were very few, I mean, there were surprises. It was surprising that Florida went to Trump when certain other states didn't. So, Trump could have had a great night and all these states went to his column, but Florida was sort of not as in sync with other states as people expected. And so that was a little bit of a surprise. It was a surprise that the Democrats didn't do better in general, but it wasn't like a total shock. It was just, here's the range of things, and here's the most likely thing that happened, and the fourth most likely one did. But the fact that states looked red at first and turned blue, and other ones looked blue at first and turned red was no surprise. Everyone who was commenting on that knew that was going to happen and what states it was going to go in which ways. And it wasn't just Florida. There was like some, place that hasn't voted a Democrat in, decades, Kentucky or something, or, also like looked blue for 15 minutes early in the night.
Yes.
And everybody on the news who was reporting it was saying, of course, it's not going to go blue. This is an artifact of this. And
the opposite was true. I mean, Virginia looked like it was going to go Republican most of the night, and then it flipped once they counted the rest of the votes. And it was, in Arizona, which Fox called. You remember Fox called, and the Trump campaign was furious.
So it's interesting here too. You want to think about individual people and their motivations when you're reading journalists, when you're thinking about who to follow. Because so Fox called Arizona early, and it called it earlier than pretty much any other news network.
Yep.
And in general, Fox was making calls earlier. So if you were watching on election night for Trump or for Biden, they were willing to take more risks in their calls.
Yep.
But there were plenty of people who you would think of as part of the liberal media establishment, left-leaning, etc., who were criticizing Fox for making that call.
Yep.
Who didn't have any doubt that. So Nate Silver is a great example of this. Who's I follow his writing on polls and elections and so forth. And he was saying, look, you can call Nevada. He was saying about other states, these should already be called, but Arizona shouldn't have been called yet. It's the probability of Arizona flipping to Trump is higher than the probability of whatever, Pennsylvania before it was called. So when you see people reasoning that way over time, that they're not always thinking the thing that they want to happen is the most probable, and they have particular reasons for it, that should give you confidence in that aspect of their thinking, not in everything, but that this is somebody who's actually trying his best to track the results and figure out what's true, rather than somebody who is trying to favor his team or something. Then how good he is at it is another question, but that's a kind of thing to keep an eye out. Someone who always thinks his party is going to win in every election is not somebody who's doing the work to try to figure out who's going to win. Whereas someone who says, look, I'm for Trump this time, but I don't think he's got a good chart. This other time I'm, is someone who's, likely being more objective.
Yep. So, how much time do you think people should spend on this in terms of trying to figure out what's going on, and to what extent do you trust the system that we have to get to the bottom? Assuming there's some valid claims, and my assumption is always there's some fraud that happens. I'm sure there's fraud on both sides, and it happens in little batches. It happens all the time. It's the systemic nature, which I am pretty convinced is nonsense. But how much? Yeah, go ahead.
I think the bigger issue than how much time you spend, because that's going to just vary tremendously with respect to your context and how much time you have and what your job is, and what the bigger issue than how much time you spend is you should know what you've put into this, and you should understand your state of knowledge and your conclusions accordingly. So I think, given my assessment of the characters of the people involved and my assessment of the system, which we'll talk about later, I dismiss these claims without looking into them. And I think it's perfectly valid to do that. But then you have to say, look, I've dismissed them. I've not looked into the evidence here. People claim to have evidence. So I'm not saying no one's given any evidence. Rudy says he has evidence and whatever. But I've not looked into it. But I think the odds are, given what I know about him and the other people, is that he's BSing. And I know that there are courts that will eventually adjudicate this. And so if you say that, that's fine. But then don't act as though I've read through all these affidavits and I can tell that this person was lying and that one there and this person had this mistake. On the other hand, if you have looked into some of these things, don't take that as meaning you've looked into all of them and you know everything. You've amateurishly looked into some of them and to try to get a feel for what's going on, which is what I've done. And on the other hand, if you trust Trump or you trust Giuliani or you trust Powell or whatever, for whatever reasons, I think you're mistaken to, and we can have an argument about why these people, I think, ought to be regarded as people who are out to destroy your mind. So that if you value reason, you should not trust them or regard them as decent human beings. But if you do trust them, and that's why you believe certain things, but without having done much work, you just saw Rudy's press conference or whatever, then you should say, I saw Rudy's press conference. I trust him that he's eventually going to deliver the goods. If he doesn't, I'll update then. And both of those two views, you know, pro-conspiracy, not anti-conspiracy, you've put very little time in, but you know you've put very little time in, and you can say, I've not put much time in it. Here's what I have done. And on the basis of that, here's what I think, and here's how confident I am. If you're going to put more time than the minimum in, you should think about what would be required to reach what kind of certainty and what kind of knowledge. And you should proportion your certainty, your conclusions, your attitude towards that.
Yeah, we can talk about the system. I mean, I'll just say, I do a commentary show, so I've looked into many of these things. So I agree with you, because of the people involved. I start out with a huge amount of skepticism about any statement that Rudy Giuliani makes. I mean, I've said on the show many times, I really despise the guy, and he's not gotten better. He's gotten worse over time, not better. Maybe there was a slight glimmer of goodness in him around 9/11, maybe, but or maybe he's just a good at taking advantage of opportunities to establish his reputation. But I've always despised Rudy Giuliani, so anything he says, I put a big question. But then what I
grew up admiring him, I should say, and I grew up admiring him, I should say. So I didn't come in. I mean, he was mayor of New York when I was a kid. Dinkins had been mayor prior. It seemed to get a lot better under him. Everyone I knew thought he was responsible, and it seemed plausible enough. And I didn't have anything against the guy until I heard you and Leonard Peikoff say a lot about him. Wow, the guy who's the mayor of New York did prosecute, but I didn't have a strong, aversion to him until he started making arbitrary claims.
And I can understand why people like him. So, when he was prosecutor, he not only went after Wall Street, but he also went after the mafia, and he did a pretty good job cleaning up the mafia using laws that I don't think should be on the books, but he did clean up the city to some extent. But
anyway, I interrupted. You were saying something about.
Yeah, I was gonna say. So what I do is I take a few of the claims, and I just do spend a little bit of time on seeing, okay, do they make any kind of sense? And I gave one example of the vote count, and you go to a fact checking site and they show you this, and you go to, you don't want to trust just one, you go to a few, and you maybe try to find the original screenshots or quotes or something. And also you find that the people advocating for this have deleted their tweets because they realize they've made a mistake. And okay, so that's one. I did a deep dive on this Dominion thing, and I don't know if you know, but the claims about Dominion systems are so crazy, are so nutty. And there's so many of them. And it's always suspicious when there's not just one conspiracy about one of these. So one conspiracy is they work with this Venezuelan company that rigged the Chavez elections and has been working for and then another conspiracy is they have a supercomputer in Germany. And the supercomputer in Germany under Obama rigged the 2012 election for Obama, and now is rigging elections again. And there's probably a dozen different conspiracy theories about Dominion. And then when you dig a little deep, like who owns Dominion, it was claimed that Nancy Pelosi's husband owns Dominion. He's a venture capitalist or a private equity guy. No, he's never owned Dominion. And he owns a company called Avid. Used to own a company called Avid, and Avid has this relationship with Dominion. They sell them software. It turns out that, yes, he does own Avid, but Avid has no relationship with Dominion. Zero.
Avid sells me software too. I mean, it's
and it doesn't sell election software. It sells graphics and movie type, video type software. So once you dig a little deeper, you suddenly discover, no, none of this makes any sense. And then in my, for my sanity, and because I have limited time and limited energy, and okay, I throw all of it out. And this relates to somebody's asking about Harriman and Bernstein. And so what is your assessment of the evidence and integration they are presented? I haven't seen any integration. What I've seen is long lists of all the different claims of fraud, several of which I've looked into and discovered are fake or just don't exist. And therefore, my assumption is the rest are the same, or at least the rest are dubious. So lists are not integrations. Lists are just lists. And you can check, just do a spot check. Check 3 of them if you care, right? If you want to put in the energy. But so I have no...
And also think about the people giving the lists. Are they showing any signs of being aware of and having done any of the work they would need to do, 1, to know if the claims are true in the first place, and 2, to, if they were true, know if they were evidence for, if they pointed to the conclusion they want, because a lot of them don't, like that there are more, that a lot of people voted for the top of the ticket and not the bottom of the ticket. As far as I can see, is no reason to think anything one way or the other. And if they're citing it as that, why? Do they show signs of knowing something you don't about why it would connect, and they're making efforts to show you why that? Or have they just swallowed something? So are they doing the work? Are they showing signs of doing the work? Have you done the work? And if not, are the people that you're getting these lists from doing the work? And then integration isn't just a list. It's something you do. You put the things together into a theory. What's the theory? Democrats are bad, and a lot of Democrats did a lot of different bad things that somehow tipped the election. A theory that integrated evidence would be a specific theory that would give a cause that would explain in a kind of comprehensive way all these different things through one mechanism. So here's a theory that explains a lot of the things that are valid. You have a president who is loathed by about half of the population. So therefore, while a little less than half of the population really loves him. So therefore, you get an election in which a whole lot of people come out and vote for just the top of the ticket, and you get a swell in voters and so forth, and you get a lot of first-time voters and so forth. So that theory there explains a couple of things all at once. And it's one thing that you can see what the mechanism is by which it would explain several. That's what an integration, it's not much of an integration. It's a pretty kind of simplistic, obvious one, but it's one thing that explains several things. What's the integration that explains all the different things that are it's just the Democrats are up to something, but that's not a theory. That's a kind of, what are they up to? What one thing are they doing that explains all of this? That would be an integration. And, maybe if Andy and Dave think that they've got some theory and they've done all this work that we haven't, and they're welcome to share it and explain it, but just pointing to some list doesn't do that.
Yep. Okay. So I want to ask you about, your confidence in the system, particularly the legal system, in vetting these claims, and in making the decisions. We got a ruling today from a federal appellate court about Giuliani's or the Trump administration's Trump's campaign's lawsuit with regard to Pennsylvania. What is your assessment of the system and whether we can trust what's going to come out of it?
There are a couple of things. We should mention that the appellate court ruling was a unanimous decision against the motion that the Trump team was bringing. They said there was no evidence and it was baseless. And the unanimous opinion was written by a federal judge appointed by Trump.
And the other two judges on the panel were Republicans. So it was 3 Republicans on the panel. It wasn't in front of the whole appellate court. It was a panel of 3. All of them Republicans, and the one who wrote the opinion, a scathing 21-page opinion, was a Trump appointee. So that
was this the 21? Because the most scathing opinion was the one a couple of days ago that was by the judge that was appointed by Obama, but was a Federalist Society member. I don't remember I haven't read this opinion yet. Just a little summary of it. So was it one of these really?
Supposedly it was very scathing, and particularly given that it was a Trump appointee. But yes,
because I did read the one by I forget his name, but the guy who was appointed by Obama as part of a deal with Toomey and was a Federalist Society.
Oh, it was a Federalist Society. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, but he was a Federalist Society guy. He had been. Anyway, so one, you're getting rulings against Trump by people who you would expect to give him every benefit of the doubt. That's something you can trust. But it's something that leads in the direction of trust, right? You can't say this is a Democratic conspiracy in the courts. But I would say if you want to think about should we trust the courts and why should we trust the courts, I think there are a couple of different things you want to bring out as relevant here. So suppose the judges are awful and the judges are on the take, or they're part of a conspiracy. There's something important about the methodology of courts and court findings that makes it different from news and press conferences, that even if the opinions were all bad and the judges were all corrupt, would make the court system better than just watching the news and seeing what comes out there. Because when the Democrats or the Republicans go on the news, they can say whatever, and there's no one to hold them accountable, and there's no rules of evidence, and they can just flood with claims and counterclaims. When they're in the court, what they do is they present a specific motion arguing that a specific action ought to be taken for specific reasons, and they give their evidence, right? So they have to give evidence. They have to give evidence that they're willing to back up and be cross-examined on and whatever, and they have to connect the evidence to the conclusion they want in a specific way. So the fact that it's in the court that they're trying to do that means that looking at their court filings looks at a case where they're, trying to really give an argument rather than just trying to win points on the news. And they're trying to give an argument to someone who's expert and good at judging these things. And so I think if you just look at the Republicans' briefs in court, they're clearer, more logical, more rational, give better reasons than you get if you look at the Trump team's, press conferences. And you'd expect that. That's, you'd expect it for anyone. The courts where they're bringing their A game and they're really trying to show what they're trying to show evidentially. So if you look at the court filings and you find that's where we'd expect the evidence to come. If you find that there isn't evidence there, then I think you should think, yeah, they don't have evidence. They don't have evidence that can stand scrutiny. So you can look at the decisions that are made, and then the judges, you can see, do they seem to be ruling fairly? Now, I've not read all the information presented that's public to any of these courts, but, you can dip in and you can see, what does this judge rule? Is that surprising? Is that fitting with what I thought already and why I thought it already? And you're thinking, why did I think it already? And you can then check. If you are worried that the Trump team's being railroaded, you can read as much as possible of the filings that these decisions that say there's no case here are responding to. And say, is there a case? Is the judge right about them?
Yeah, it is a pretty scathing. I'm just looking at it right now. It's a 21-pager. He basically says, there's just no ground. He says that the number of ballots that they're trying to challenge is smaller than the 81,000 vote margin, that the whole thing is, it just, so he and then he spends 21 pages on it. So it's, and this is the Trump appointee. So somebody, Gene asks, California delivered mail-in ballots to all voters. My mom received a ballot from my sister who moved to Texas years ago. Even if there isn't any large-scale fraud, does it seem like representative states take voting security? Should they take voting security more seriously?
I don't know. So one, when they mail ballots out to everyone, is that a voting security concern? Well, if you don't know anything, it certainly seems like it might be, and it might be. But maybe they take a lot of steps when they come back to double check the signature and this. You'd want to know what the whole process is to know how secure or insecure it is. And I don't know what the whole process is. I do know that you constantly get complaints from Democrats that the system's made too hard to vote. And everybody, it's difficult to vote, and people and the difficulties in voting, privilege, richer and whiter and this or and that are people, and so people are being excluded and disenfranchised. You're always getting claims like that from the Democrats, and you're always getting claims from the Republicans that things are too lax in a way that allows for voter fraud. And I'm not convinced of either of those claims. It doesn't seem to me. I've lived in a bunch of different states. The voting rules are different. In none of them is it so awfully onerous that I felt that I or someone with less resources than me would be disenfranchised. And in a way, I'm more likely to be disenfranchised because you move to a state and you've got a few months if you move there in September as a professor or a grad student, and you're poor usually as a grad student, right? I mean, there are plenty of people poorer, but you move to a place out of the blue and you've got to figure out what to do. I think if it was so hard that you were disenfranchised, I'm just not convinced of it. And then on the other hand, there's all the attempts to show widespread fraud, including an attempt by Trump, by a team he put together when he claimed there was widespread fraud after the previous election that denied him the popular vote, which he claimed that he won. None of them have turned up any kind of significant amount of fraud. So I think there's a lot of electioneering on both sides, trying to set rules that are within the range of what I think would be reasonable rules, but that balance security and access. But the Republicans trying to push it one way and the Democrats trying to push it another. And I don't think it's really all that important which way it goes in different states.
Yeah, and there's no reason to think this election was different, although it strikes me as pretty dumb of the Democrats to, be if this was a conspiracy, to be sending those votes in California, which they had locked. Yeah. They were winning anyway. So why commit fraud in a state you're already winning? It doesn't surprise me that government is incompetent in certain areas and that voter security is not great. Although I have to say, in Puerto Rico, for example, I had to register to vote. When I registered to vote, I got a voter registration card. I had to bring the voter registration card, which has my photo, to the voting. They checked it. They had a list, voting place where I was registered. They had a list. They checked me off. I don't think anybody else could have voted in my name. And I don't know how the vote by mail worked, but my guess is you probably would have had to write down the number of the voter registration card. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this things. There's not just you get something in the mail, you fill out thing, you put it in an envelope and you send it back. There are all kinds of little barriers that are put in there to secure the votes. And I'm just, while I think there's fraud out there, I'm skeptical it goes in one direction. I'm skeptical I'm convinced it's not systemic. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are all kinds of little things that people do that are crazy.
And there have been people trying to prove the fraud for a long time, right? And if there was a lot of it, I think there'd be better evidence than we've seen.
Trump spent a lot of time after the last election trying to prove that he won the popular vote, and we never saw anything come of that. Nothing.
Well, I mean, a lot of times he appointed a commission,
yes,
which commission dissolved after finding no evidence, and we know that it found no evidence because people subpoenaed it to get. But he didn't spend a lot of time because he doesn't actually do the work of knowledge. But I wanted to say one thing that I disagree with you on a little bit. I do think there's a reason to be a little bit more leery or wary or suspicious about this election than some others, just because of the pandemic, there was a massive surge in mail voting, and people somewhat changing the rules at the last minute or to this or that to accommodate it. And so there was an additional challenge with this election, right? Mm-hmm. We had to do, there was work involved in tabulating the votes, and they had to do it in a different way. And so when things are changing quickly on a dime, there's more chance for errors. And so I think it makes more sense that there should be recounts, and we should have a little bit stricter scrutiny than we otherwise would, even with no assumption of malfeasance or worry about malfeasance. Just easier to make mistakes when you're doing something new you haven't done as much before. And then if there are bad actors, maybe they can find a way to take advantage of that. So I think it makes sense that people should look at this election a little more closely than at previous ones, just for that reason. Mm-hmm. But none of that substantiates the kind of over the top speculations, and it doesn't substantiate specific theories. So we should be studying, when someone's looking for the truth, they're usually not trying to prove or disprove one specific hypothesis, at least not until late in the game. The way you'd think about this, if you were concerned about the effects of mail-in voting and the effects of a shift to more mail-in voting in some states, and is what were the effects of that? Not were the effects of it to enable fraud, or just how can we understand what changed, and be open to whatever emerges from the evidence. And I think people should and will investigate that as time goes by.
Yeah, I agree. So somebody's asking, why are you still punching down on a right you think is lost? Why not at least champion getting rid of mass mail-ins that didn't exist before COVID? I mean, I don't see any problem with mass mail-ins. I would like to see online voting. I know it's much trickier security-wise and much more, people are going to be very skeptical of, but I think blockchain and other technologies make it. I want to make it, if we're going to vote, then, there's no, in the context of the world in which we live, there's no reason not to make it simple. Now, I would like to change the voting rules and make it hard, but that's a completely different conversation in a different type of political system. But the system we have right now, I have nothing against mail-in voting. I don't know if you think differently.
I think a lot of different ways of voting are fine. I think it's fine that some have more mail-in, some have less. I don't have a strong opinion on whether one's more, how much more or less secure one is than the other. I think whatever the differences are probably pretty minor. If you look at states that switched to primarily or exclusively mail-in voting, I think Wisconsin is one. I forget which state they've had, some Republicans won, some Democrats. There wasn't a radical shift in who won time after time, and a lot of people like it. So I think the Constitution leaves it up to states to determine how they're going to vote, and different states choose differently. And I think that's fine. That's federalism, and it's all right. And I think every state should look to the others and see what works and what doesn't. But I don't see a problem here. I don't see the problem the Democrats see about mass disenfranchisement due to the voting laws, and I don't see the problem the Republicans see of a lot of voter fraud. I just don't think there's much evidence of either.
I agree. I voted by mail a few times, and I liked it. I mean, it was convenient. It was easy. I've also done early voting. In California, they allow early voting, and they set up. I remember one year they set up the voting booths at the airports, where I spent a lot of time. And so I just voted when I was at the airport, and it was amazing. It was so convenient. So I think Greg's completely right. I mean, one of the nice things about federalism is on some of these optional issues, you get experimentation and you get variety. Different states do it differently.
We have early voting in Texas, which is nice. In fact, you can vote right across the street from my office at Austin. Of course, I'm not there at all this semester because of the pandemic, so I voted somewhere else. But yeah, it's a good thing, I think.
And it's interesting, again, related to the fraud, that a lot of, Georgia's a Republican state. And in spite of that fact that everybody in positions of power, they're Republicans, it went for Biden. And they're trying to claim that there were issues there, but again, no evidence, zero evidence. Let's see this one. Yeah, go ahead.
On evidence, I just want to reiterate something I've been saying. It's, before you take something as evidence of something, you want to think, do I know it's true? And then how does it connect to the thing it's supposed to be evidence for? If it's supposed to be an explanation of the thing that it's evidence for, what are the range of different ways you might explain it? What are the different things that cause it? And do I know enough to pick out this one as the most likely cause, or the thing that would cause it where the others couldn't really cause it? And if you don't know the answer to either of those questions, if you don't know how you can tell that the thing is true in the first place, and or you don't know why this supports the conclusion that it's being offered as evidence for, as opposed to any number of other conclusions, then the thing is no evidence for you. Maybe someone else understands all this and it's evidence for him, and maybe the guy who told it to you isn't spouting the arbitrary, but it still stands as the arbitrary in your mind insofar as you can't tell if it's true, and therefore it can't do its job of helping you to tell that the conclusion's true. Or you can tell that it's true, but you can't tell how it would make the conclusion true. So you need to be able to do both of those things before you count it as evidence. Until then, it's just something someone said that they think has to do with this conclusion, but I don't see it.
Yep.
So there was something else on the chat or something.
Yeah, there's a number of questions here. Let me see. Some of them are off topic. We'll get to those at the end. Somebody says PA violated the Constitution by not doing their mail-in ballots properly. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court approved that. The mail-in ballots that are in dispute around that are too small to make a difference. The numbers wouldn't make a difference. These are ballots that arrived later than the date. That's probably going to
not been counted, I think, anyway. Have they? They're not part of the ones. They were sequestered on an order from Alito, as I recall, and I think they're not part of the count anyway. Maybe they are, and they're too small, but
they're not going to impact this. And it, the Supreme Court is going to decide, but it's a marginal issue. And again, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decided that this was okay before the election, not after the election. Before the election, so it wasn't like after the results were in. Before the election, they said it was okay. And again, federalism, we allow states some leeway here. I doubt that the Supreme Court would overturn this, but we'll see if it ever gets there. Let's see. I think the biggest interference in the election was legal. Biased media, gatekeeping of news, Twitter banning links to some stories, Google sent voting reminders only to liberals, etc. While some of that is true, I'll just say, I think you have to really question this, particularly in comparison to the past. I've said this many times, I'll repeat it now. Think about Ronald Reagan in 1980 running for president. Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. They controlled the Supreme Court. They controlled, in a sense, all three media outlets. There were only three: television, right? ABC, NBC, CBS, maybe PBS counts. All three were left. All the main newspapers were left. The New York Times has gotten worse. I think that's true. But remember, New York Times, Ayn Rand was talking about the New York Times and how biased it was in the 60s and 70s. So it was suddenly left. All the major newspapers were left. There was no talk radio. There was no voice for the right anywhere. There was one or two shows that had William F. Buckley on them or something, but that's about it. And there was no internet where you could actually independently go and check and look. There was no sources for any alternative news. So I'm skeptical about this whole idea that it's worse now, in terms of if you want to figure out what's going on in the world, you don't have access because there are roadblocks to you.
The reason people think it's worse now is because of how much better it is.
Yes.
If all you had was leftist echo chamber media, it would be hard for you to recognize that there are things that you're not hearing. Now you have so many sources of information where you're hearing things you don't get from the mainstream that you start to think, well, why isn't the mainstream saying this thing? But there's never been more alternative voices that it's easy to get access to than right now, and specifically never been more right-wing voices than right now. So this is just... Now, that doesn't mean that maybe Google's not doing something bad in this or that case.
Yeah.
But the idea that this is, the right wing can't get its opinion out is, I think, just not true. But you said, the question said the election interference was these other things. That might be right, but I'm really bothered by the idea of, I don't quite have what terms I would use, but packaging together things that interfere in the voting process or the process of tabulation of votes, and things, however immoral or wrong or good or whatever it is, that try to confuse or persuade people into picking someone other than who they otherwise would have picked. So I think when the Russian hacking of the DNC server and spreading that information was described as hacking the election, I think that was a real mistake. It was not hacking it's not like they didn't hack the election machines. They didn't confuse people about where the polling places were. What they did is engaged in a propaganda campaign using stolen information, and it was a crime and bad, and it ought to have been investigated, as it was. But it wasn't hacking the election. You're hacking the election if you're trying to get it to seem like Iran voted for someone who he didn't, or that his dead grandfather voted for someone. And there's been, I think, too much of a running together of those things. So I think if someone did something nefarious to poison people's minds against Trump or Biden, we should discuss that under a different heading than discussing if someone interfered with the casting or tabulation of votes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, somebody's saying here that cancel culture makes it worse because people don't always let themselves realize that they're self-censoring. I mean, first of all, while cancel culture is awful, there are so many people calling out cancel culture. There's so many people who are not self-censoring. There's so many, I mean, I'm one, and there are plenty of other people online who are talking about the cancel culture and why it's wrong and what are the issues and so on. And cancel culture has always existed. There's always been a certain attitude that people have had, whether on the left or whether on the right. I mean, William F. Buckley canceled Ayn Rand, right? What did he do? He said, I don't want you in the conservative movement. You're out. I mean, it's always existed. And in some ways, in the past, there weren't alternative venues for you to go to express your opinion. If you were canceled from ABC, NBC, CBS, there was nowhere else to do television. Today, there are like 3,000 different venues from which you can communicate with people, even if some people have canceled you. So again,
you're a victim of cancel culture from Fox, right?
Yeah, I was canceled by Fox in 2012 and then in 2016 again, and I still have never really gone. They've never accepted me back. So, this, but I haven't silenced me. And the point is that never in human history have there been more avenues for people to express their opinions, including unbelievably, controversial opinions, than there is right now, in spite of cancel culture.
I mean, there are lots of things though to object to about people being censorious and unfair and unjust, and and some of what goes under the heading of cancel culture. There are lots of people who are victims of unjust attacks. So it shouldn't be trivialized, but the idea that directed against conservatives is swaying elections, I think, is strange. I mean, we have a president who got to be president, or now, I mean, he's now been voted out, but got to be president largely because of Twitter and his Twitter following, and against a party that hated him at first, and now he's won them all over. That is not something that happened in a kind of censored, cloistered media environment. And we had two of them. Obama was an upset victory in the Democratic Party in 2000. Our last two presidents were people who broke through social media, via social media and grassroots campaigns, broke through an establishment that didn't want them.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's see. They say I seem to be dismiss the severity of the restrictions. No, I mean the victim of them. I don't dismiss the severity. I just don't think. First of all, I find it interesting that the left claims that they're being censored, so-called censored, on Twitter and Facebook as well. Just watch some of the leftist commentators. Again, everybody's in their own little echo chamber, and they just hear what they want to hear. But no, Twitter's done some horrible things, and Facebook's done some horrible things to people I don't think deserved it. And I would love to see them have objective standards, so I knew if I violated them or not, so that I could function more. All of that is true, but I don't think that's what sways elections. I don't think that is what is shaping the cultural direction or the direction of the culture. I think it's a reflection of the direction the culture is heading, not that it's shaping it. All right. Let's see. Okay, so do you think Rudy Giuliani believes his own BS? I think that people like Rudy, I mean, this is more true of Trump than Rudy. I don't know enough about Rudy. It doesn't matter to them, right? So they don't hold truth as a category. So it's, will it get me what I need getting done, right? Is this useful? And so it's not, so they think it's true to some extent, but they're evading everything that would reject it. So but it's not truth as what truth means to us. It's just, does it get the job done? So they're real pragmatists in a deep philosophical sense, not as just, we don't have principles, as we don't care about principles. We don't care about truth.
But the job is pandering to their own emotions. So somebody who, and this is dishonest and bad, but somebody who is a calculating, conniving person who is just interested in what will get people to vote for him or whatever, or get people to give him money or whatever. That's one kind of, the job is, get $50 in my pocket. But for deeply dishonest and irrational people, the job they're trying to get done is making themselves feel better about things, not facing certain facts, preventing them from coming up against their own insecurities. And I think that's what drives really bad people most of the time. And I mean, this gets into the psychology of Trump and Giuliani. You have to figure out, I have fewer views about Giuliani than about Trump, but I think Trump is essentially an acausal thinker who is interested in what will help him fake to himself and get other people to help him fake to himself the image of the world he wants to see. So Trump doesn't want to be a loser. Mm-hmm. And I think all of these suits are about keeping up the pretense to himself that he's not. I don't think they think they're going to work. So that's what I think it's about. But that's a conclusion that I reached from following him over years and seeing what he does.
Well, and I think it's more than that. I don't think it's just proving to himself that he's not a loser. But I do think there's a broader agenda here, which is what people like about him is that he's supposedly a fighter, right? He fights the left. Mm-hmm. And if he just conceded, then they'd go, well, there's nothing special about him. The fact that he won't concede, and I don't think he will concede, and no matter what the Supreme Court says or anybody says, he will not concede. He wants to leave with his base intact, his base supporting him. He wants to leave as a fighter. He wants to leave as somebody who never gave in, who never broke, who never gave into the mainstream media, whatever, however he wants to frame it, and who will always fight for the so-called cause. It's not really a cause; it's just fight for him. But so it's a combination of privacy of consciousness, which is definitely there throughout his career, with a great marketing ploy to keep his base with him so that he can continue to have power over the Republican Party. I said early on in this election that Trump needs to lose by a landslide because that's the only way the Republican Party can recover from him. By losing by a relatively small margin, which he did, he's going to keep a lot of power in the Republican Party, and the party's going to be shaped by him for a long time, which I think is tragic.
It's real tragedy. When we're making these conclusions about his character and what motivates him, I think it's worth saying a bit about how you can know these things, that you're not taking our words for them. And it takes a lot of time over periods of watching someone, but I want to give a particular thing that I think is useful, a kind of mental exercise. And it's useful with respect to Trump, but it's useful with respect to all kinds of conflicts between people. If you have conflict between friends or business associates, people talk about to judge someone, you need to put yourself in their shoes. And they think that doing that, will make you give them the benefit of the doubt or whatever. But often I find that people don't judge people harshly enough because they don't put themselves in the other person's shoes. So I think you ought to think about, in any of these kind of cases, it's true of politicians, Biden, Trump, it's true of personal disputes, business disputes, it's true of disputes within the objectivist movement, it's true of disputes everywhere. you think about someone and you think, suppose I was in their position. If you take the things they officially say they hold and what they say their values and their purposes are, and you take the facts about the other parties as they claim them to be, right? Suppose you're in their position and that's what you think. You really believe either the Democrats are out to get me and I didn't do anything untoward with Russia if you're Trump, but people are trying to pin it on me that I did and this and that. And you just take everything that they claim that's not, crazy. You can get your head around what it would be like to think this and assume that that's true. And assume that your values are now you want to be the president and make America great again. Or now you want to make sure that there's no election fraud or whatever the issue is. And then don't look at what they did, but think, what would I do if I believed all these things? How would I comport myself? And I valued these things. How would I comport myself? And what would my goals be? And what goals would be governing and determining my actions? So now I'm president of a country that I know to be deeply divided. I know a lot of people in the country really hate me and are upset that I'm president. Others are really enthusiastic that I'm president. Everybody has a lot of mistrust. And I've said in my speech on election night that I now want to try to, govern and help the country, whatever, and make the country great again. And now these allegations have come out. What would my priorities be? How would I try to get the country to come together? How would I try to convince the people? How would I try to dispel these charges against me so that everybody could see that there was no truth in them? What would I be doing? What would my proximate goals would be? And then you look at what the person actually does. And when they're different than what you would do, and the proximate goals seem to be different from what yours are, think about, well, why is that? How must this person be thinking? And maybe you'll find a good way for him to be thinking. But usually often what you'll find, I think what you'll find in the Trump case, is that this is not a person who values the things that you value and that he claims to value. This is a person who's driven in some way other than by what he's claiming. And I think you can find that in a lot of people a lot of the time. I know it's a upsetting thing to find, but I've had friends who I've noticed this about, and sometimes you'll notice it about yourself. You're not doing what you would do if you were your best self. And I think it's through kind of mental thought experiments like that you come to understand what people's motivations are. And you could be wrong, you could be mistaken, but you then test it over time and how do they behave, and you come to understand what's driving them.
Yep. That's great advice. All right. I guess this is the last one on this topic, and then we've got some general philosophical questions. I've told people to certain questions to wait until Greg's on because I have no clue what the answer is.
All right, so we have a battery of ones I might not know either.
We have two of those. We have two of those. Bree writes, my problem with this whole thing is how many people seem to care about what clown is juggling in center ring. We should be worrying about the cult that is 2020 politics. This is the result of too much government power. I mean, but because there's so much government power, there's a reason to care about who the clown is juggling in the center ring, because they have a huge impact because government has so much power. But you're right. The fundamental problem is that government is such a big role in our life. And therefore, who is governing us is important. It shouldn't be this important.
Yeah, I mean, it should have some importance, but it's there's some people criticize. Some people interested in objectivism criticize other objectivists. This has been every election I've been in for thinking, well, I've never met anyone who's actually made this mistake on either side, but I've met lots of people who've criticized people for doing it, that, well, you're only not voting for this guy because you're holding out for some perfect candidate.
Yes, I hear that.
When we have the perfect world, that would be, but obviously we're in this world, therefore I'm voting for this guy. And yeah, that would be wrong to do. The president shouldn't have much power, so it shouldn't matter. Yeah, but he does. And the whole issue of figuring out how to vote is you have to think about, we're in the world we're in. It's a very different society from my ideal society. It's also different, we should mention, from the worst society. We're not in the USSR or Venezuela, and we're not 2 minutes away from being either of them, right? So we're in the society we're in with its positive features and its bad features. And you have to have a theory and understanding of what trajectory we're on and what do these people mean for that trajectory. And in most elections, you'll find neither of them is changing the trajectory much. It's, this thing will be slightly better and that'll be slightly worse if it's this guy than that guy. And then you don't vote, or you vote for whichever you think is slightly worse. And some of them you think of are really changing the trajectory for better or worse. And when you think it's someone like that, then I think you have to vote. And it's important because if we're not Venezuela, we could become Venezuela or the USSR. Or on the other hand, we could become a much better country than we are. So when you think there's a real difference between these people and what they pretend for the country, then you should vote, and you should think about whether it is that difference and argue with people about it. You can't don't let it take over your life, but it's one part of being a citizen.
And one of the interesting things about this election is the extent of deferring opinions about Trump, not just as a person, but in terms of his impact on the future trajectory of the country. That is the impact he has. I mean, the two of us, had a very clear opinion about how bad Trump was, and said so from day one. And yet there are people, there are many people who many objectivists who have a very different opinion of Trump, or that have a very, very different opinion about the trajectory. That is the damage he does, even if they don't think he's good, the damage he does. So,
and that explains, because it's not just objectivists. Everybody thinks something's different and special about this president. He's different in a way that's pivotal to the country. That explains why there was such a large turnout, both a larger than usual turnout of people supporting him and a larger than usual turnout of people rejecting him and voting for the alternative, because everyone knows nobody, I mean, the leftists, the middle of the roaders, nobody loves Joe Biden. Everyone just thinks, he's the other flavor on offer. So that's why Joe Biden got more votes than anybody got, including Obama, and why Trump got more votes.
So we keep getting these political questions, but on the topic. But so I think Trump really does want to make America great again. He's talked about these issues for decades on talk shows, but he's not capable of acting rationally or optimally because of his personal flaws. So I'll just say, I think that Donald Trump has some vague notion of what America is. It's a flawed notion. It's completely detached from what we think America is and what it represents. And he has some notion that he would like to be the guy who makes it great, whatever that word even means in his context. But it's not that it's just that he can't act rationally optimally because of his personality flaws. He can't act rationally optimally because he can't act rationally. That is, his view of America is wrong. His view of greatness is wrong. And therefore, he can't act rationally to implement things that are completely, in a sense, irrational, that are detached from reality. So everything about this, and you can't separate personality flaws from conclusions and actions.
And his view of making is wrong. Yeah. So if it's make America great again, he's wrong about America, he's wrong about greatness, and he's wrong about making. Yeah. Making for him is massaging things in people's consciousness. So, it's like a huckster's conman kind of view.
Yes, very much. All right, let's see. Okay, here's a question about the founders, or about constitutions. Why was it wrong for the was it wrong? Okay, was it wrong for the founders to put in conditions on which you could change the Constitution? In an objectivist society, and more deeply an objectivist constitution, wouldn't there be non-negotiable clauses, speech, property rights, etc.?
No, I think it's right that there's an amending process. The Constitution is a political document for a community of people to live and order themselves together. And you can't freeze it so that if they come to believe something other than what they have now is right, they have no way to change it. And they wouldn't have known which parts to freeze and which parts not to freeze. It's just like, should you somehow lock your mind, like if there was a lock in your mind that you can press it and then you couldn't change your mind about anything, or even you couldn't change your mind about the things that you now understand to be the most important things. Well, the things that you now understand to be the most important things are A is A, and consciousness's job is to know existence, and reason is our means of survival, then that would tell you, yeah, don't press that button. Those things have plenty of good evidence for them. I'm not going to change my mind about them. And because of them, I know that I need to be able to follow the evidence wherever it goes. And there's a great scene in Atlas Shrugged where Dabney's making a very big decision, and I'll give away too much of the plot, but this is brought up with regard to philosophy in a scene in Atlas Shrugged, and I think it's true for constitutions as well.
Yes. All right. Since Greg is on the show, I'll ask the question again. Is the concept subjective a stolen concept when used by subjectivists? What would they be basing the subjective on, especially if they reject intrinsicism?
So subjective, when used in a positive light by subjectivists, they say this is subjective, yay, in effect. Is that I'm not sure I'm understanding the question.
I guess.
If they were using it as a criticism, then it would certainly be a stolen concept. If they're but they wouldn't be, I think.
No, they were defending it.
So what they're saying is there are two categories of things. There are things that are made up by people, and there are things that are kind of dictated by reality without the mind having to do anything to work them out. And they're saying about the subjectivists are saying about the relevant thing that they're in the first of those categories. So I don't see how kind of locally there's a stolen concept. But if you're denying objectivity, in a way you're stealing all concepts, because if there's no objectivity, then none of these terms mean anything. So in that sense, you could say they're stealing all concepts. But there might be something more specific that you have in mind that I'm not seeing. So I want to hear how you understand it to be a stolen concept.
Yeah, I'll keep track of the chat to see if he comes back with something. What's the difference between awareness and focal awareness?
Well, there's something you're seeing now out of the corner of your eye. So like right now I'm looking on the part of my screen that is below my camera and has my face, but kind of in the left periphery of my vision, I see you're on. And that's the difference between awareness and focal awareness. That's just at the visual level. Now at the conceptual level, you're thinking about something. Say now you're thinking about consciousness and awareness, but there are other things that are at some level in your consciousness and accessible to you that, like, thoughts that flit around on the periphery by analogy. And all you can do is use an analogy here to what's on the periphery of your vision. So you're thinking, well, what time is it? And how much, and what am I going to have to eat later? And, or something seems not quite right about what I'm saying, or whatever it is, that's not kind of the main thought you're having, but it's occurs to you in a kind of transient way. And that's the non-focal part of your awareness.
Let's see. Okay, this is just a compliment, completely unrelated to topic at hand, but love your bookshelves, Greg.
Oh, thanks. These are the kind of cheapy hardware store kind of ones that are in my backup office room. The nicer ones are in the room out there, but I'm glad you like them. I think they came out pretty well.
I love bookshelves, but the fact is I'm getting rid of all of mine. It's hard for me to do, but in my new place, there are going to be very few bookshelves. Everything's on a Kindle now, so.
Oh, I can't do it. I've had like a library ladder built that slides around.
I know you have these amazing, but
so many more things I do get on the Kindle now, and I don't remember if I own the real book because I haven't organized certain parts of my library since I moved here, and there is a real value to electronic books.
Yeah, no, I love the electronic books. Just the fact that I can go anywhere with my entire library is very cool. But yes, I've been trimming my books in California as I've been figuring out shrinking my library slowly. All right, let's go through these quickly. Is there a difference between an invalid concept and an anti-concept, and if so, what?
Yeah. So an invalid concept is a concept that isn't valid, doesn't do the work a concept needs to do, isn't justified, and so you shouldn't have it. But an anti-concept is intentional. So it's an intentional invalid concept aimed at subverting the mind. So an invalid concept is a concept that is bad, it harms you, it makes your thinking muddier rather than clearer, it gets you away from the truth, but calling it invalid doesn't say one way or the other about the honesty or dishonesty of it, or the motivations behind it. An anti-concept is a concept that's introduced to muddy, clog up the works, etc. Yeah. You might hold it innocently, but you've had something pulled over on you, where as opposed to you just might be confused, or the person who told you might have just been confused.
So your answer about the subjectivism clarified the issue for Rez, particularly when you said that everything is a stolen concept once you deny reality. There's a sense in which everything's a stolen concept. Greg, do you see a connection between guitar playing and philosophy? I do in terms of the sounds, chords, strings, and guitar itself. I play 12 string.
Well, I mean, everything's connected to everything, and everything's certainly connected to philosophy, but I don't see some particular connection like you're a 12-string player and Kant had 12 categories, and therefore you must be a Kantian. I see music, art's a value in life, music's a value in life. And, you know, guitar is one instrument you can play music on. I do, though, see it as I've thought a lot about I've used a lot of examples to do with music and playing music in thinking philosophically, because it's a skill that I've acquired. I mean, I acquired it a long time ago, but I've learned other instruments over the years. And you think about what automatization works like in doing that, what it's like to be fluent in something versus non-fluent, ways in which knowledge can be automatized, what it's like to understand things versus not understand them. And so I think a lot about music and guitar playing in that way as examples of things, but I don't see a particular connection between music and philosophy that doesn't apply to other arts and other skills.
What about the claims of catastrophe involving COVID? Is there fraud by public health authorities and the media in panicking the economy, the country?
Fraud is, you know, there's this old aphorism, I don't know who said it, but, you know, never attribute to malice what could be explained by incompetence. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, you know, again, there's maybe fraud somewhere by some people on the margins. I'm sure someone's trying to make a quick buck or whatever out of something by exaggerating things about COVID. But no, the COVID's a frightening, difficult situation. It is a catastrophe. Some parts of it didn't have to be as catastrophic as they are if they weren't as bungled as they have been by America's government, but also by Europe's government and China before that. So there is a real catastrophe here. And I think there are a lot of people who are in authority who are genuinely panicked, and in the media who are genuinely panicked. And some of them are making mistakes. There are a lot of mistakes are being made in part because of that. I don't know in a lot of cases what the right move is. So, but I'm confident that, you know, panic causes people to make mistakes, and some mistakes I think we could see. And I think that that explains most of what's gone wrong, rather than someone with a nefarious plot who's, you know, fraudulently claiming things that they know not to be true.
So there are conspiracy theories or theories about the government manipulating the data, reporting that is flawed on purpose in order to give government more power. So there are these claims of fraud, that the CDC is reporting bogus numbers, you know, things like that. And again, I think everything we talked about with regard to the election apply here in terms of evidence.
And another thing does too, and it's also relevant to the election case. One of the things you have to think about when you think about people not being objective, if you think they're not, is how much work is required to get the actual knowledge. So how many people died of COVID? Boy, that's a hard thing to figure out. If anybody knows how many people died of COVID, a whole lot of work would have had to have been done of getting death reports from all these different places. If a person had 2 or 3 conditions, how do you figure out which one killed them? There are ways to do it, but it's a lot of work. And then collating that data. And what if Wisconsin calculates it differently than Arkansas, and we have to put it together, get a national. So there's this tremendous amount of work that the CDC must be doing to do this. There are going to be a lot of judgment calls in that work, and ways that maybe they get it right, but it's not obvious that they get it right unless you know how to do it. Or maybe they get it wrong, but because it's hard to do. So before you say, like, my friend Joe told me that it's fewer than, and you know, my friend's mother was 90 and she died and they put it down to COVID, but really she fell down the stairs or whatever. Before you know what to make of that, you've got to think there's all this work being done. I don't know how to do it. I'm maybe not confident, less confident than I otherwise would be in the numbers they're coming out with, but as you get some of this information that might make you question it. But to say that they're committing fraud, you first have to recognize what a tremendous challenge it is to get an answer to this question at all. And then you start to think about how well or badly are these people doing at meeting that challenge. And then if you come to think badly, then the question is, well, is the badly due to dishonesty or not? But there are plenty of ways to get things wrong and to do it badly if you're perfectly honest. It's hard. It's hard work to get this right.
All right, last question was, what do you make of conservatives moving from Fox to Newsmax?
I think Fox cares too much about the truth for them.
Yeah.
And too much about evidence, which I don't think it cares all that much about.
No, I was going to say, I didn't think I'd ever hear that sentence. But yes, I think that's right. And Newsmax doesn't. And you've got others, you got a bunch of others, and you're going to be more. Because
and I don't know what'll happen. So I really hope that people come back to the fold and to Fox and so forth, and it doesn't go further in that direction. And that when someone like Tucker Carlson, raises questions about Powell and what she's done and so forth, that people come around and who trust Tucker Carlson, who I don't, but I mean, I think he has more standards than some other people. On a number of issues, not just this. He was, raising the alarm about COVID earlier than some other people were too. But will come around and be swayed by Tucker Carlson and the people on Fox and whatever, rather than going to some place that just wants to indulge in speculations that Fox won't. And we'll see. I mean, we'll see if to what extent Fox is like Gail Wynand, to what extent they only have their following because they're pandering to them. And when they push back on anything that the following wants, they go to someone who's willing to do the pandering instead.
That is going to be interesting because there are plenty of takers to try to do the pandering. There's plenty of other people who are trying that, and it'll be interesting to see if they succeed on that.
I have to say, I wrote out what I thought would happen during the Trump presidency at the very beginning of it, the night that he won. And
almost all of it came true.
It was pretty accurate. I have to say, I was surprised when I looked back as to how accurate it was. But I thought the Republicans there'd be more Republicans more standing up. There would be more daylight between him and the Republican Party and the Republican voters who at first voted for him reluctantly than there was. And the Republican electorate has gotten, by my lights, a lot worse since his presidency, much faster than I thought would happen. The other thing I was significantly wrong about is I thought the Democrats would swing way far to the left very quickly. And, that part of the party has gotten louder and more powerful, but not nearly as quickly as I thought. And they were roundly defeated in the primaries. So I thought the Republicans would be better than they were, and the Democrats would be worse, though both have been bad, and I expect them to be bad.
Yeah, I mean, Democrats lost some ground in the House in some districts where they thought they would be moving dramatically to the left in significant ways.
And I think that's a good sign.
Like the far left lost a lot in some of the, I've talked about this on the show, and a lot of the kind of the what do you call it, the
woke or the what is it?
The word escapes me, but the states where the ballot initiatives.
Oh, swing states and so forth.
Well, no, the ballot initiatives were not about voting for a person, but voting.
Yes, the referenda.
I mean, the referendums, the far left lost in almost all.
California's ballot initiatives all went the anti-leftist way, and that's good because the way the left went were terrible for California.
Yeah. And they protected the anti-affirmative action, which was shocking. So. Yes, I mean, I thought the results in those were all good, even in places like Illinois. Illinois turned down a progressive income tax. They kept the flat income tax, which was shocking. So it was, but I agree. I thought that I couldn't imagine that Republicans would be as bad as they turned out to be.
And the reason I mentioned this about what my predictions were wrong on before is related to the Newsmax Fox thing. Like if you asked me this in, 2016 and you told me, and people are going to think Fox is too conventional and they're going to go over to Newsmax, I would say, yeah, that'll be a flash in the pan and it won't happen and whatever. But now I'm less sure. I hope that's, what happens. And Fox continues to be the source for these people, or someplace better than Fox. I mean, one of the real tragedies in America is that we don't have any good right-wing journalism.
Mhm.
That we don't have any good journalism that's actually trying to counteract the leftist spin in journalism, that's really working hard not to respin whatever is already in the news, but to find facts that the New York Times and the Washington Post aren't finding, but that cares about whether they're facts. I mean, cares at least as much as the Times and the Post does about whether they're facts. And we don't have that. The closest we have is Fox, and it's not that good.
Well,
And
on some issues, the Wall Street Journal, but again, it's the same.
but their editorial page is more, but their newsroom doesn't seem to be more right than the other newsrooms. So maybe a little bit.
It's a little bit more right, or at least it has more understanding of the issues around business and economy than the newsrooms of the New York Times do. So it's not an issue of right or left. It's more of an issue of just they have domain expertise.
Fair enough.
Good. Well, thanks, Greg. This was great.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it. Yeah, we've gone for 2 hours, so really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll have you on again soon. Have a great rest of the holiday season.
Yeah. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year and whatever other holidays are.
Say hi to Austin. I'm looking forward to one of these days to making it back there.
Yeah, I'd really like to do some events here with you.
Yep.
And
as soon as this
looking forward to
insanity is over,
when that's possible.
Yep.
Right. Thanks.
Good.
Good
Thanks,
night,
Greg.
everyone.
Bye. Good night.